Margaret Hayes had been sitting on the same wooden bench at Cedar Creek Station for 21 days, watching every train with the desperate hope that Robert McKinnon would finally appear and explain why he was 3 weeks late for their wedding. The letter in her reticule had grown soft from constant handling, its carefully written words promising her a new life in Colorado territory. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "I will be counting the days until you arrive on the April 15th train." But April 15th had come and gone without a sign of him. So had every day since, each sunset taking with it another piece of her carefully constructed dreams. She had $17 to her name, nowhere to sleep except the station bench, and a growing certainty that Robert McKinnon was either dead or had changed his mind about wanting a wife. The other passengers had begun giving her pitying looks and whispered comments about that poor woman waiting for someone who clearly isn't coming. On this particular afternoon, as the 247 westbound pulled into the station, Margaret barely bothered to look up from her tear-stained letter. But then she heard it, a small voice, high and heartbroken, calling out above the noise. "Papa, wait! Don't leave me!" Margaret's head snapped up to see a little girl of perhaps 6 running down the platform, her blue dress flying behind her, tears streaming down her face as she chased after the departing train. The child stumbled, caught herself, and kept running until it became clear the train was beyond catching. The girl stopped at the platform's end, shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed too big for such a small body. No one seemed to notice the crying child who had been left behind. Margaret found herself moving before she'd consciously decided to. She approached the girl slowly and knelt down to bring herself to eye level. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "are you all right? Where are your parents?" The little girl looked up with the biggest, saddest brown eyes Margaret had ever seen. "My papa put me on the train in Denver," she said, her voice trembling. "He said my aunt would meet me here, but I don't see anyone. And now the train is gone, and I don't know how to get back to him." Margaret's heart clenched with recognition. Here was another soul stranded by broken promises, another person whose careful arrangements had fallen apart. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lucy Morrison," the girl replied, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "Well, Lucy Morrison, my name is Margaret Hayes, and I think we might be able to help each other," Margaret said, making a decision that surprised her with its clarity. "I've been waiting here for someone who doesn't seem to be coming either. Perhaps we should wait together." Lucy studied Margaret's face with the serious consideration of a child who'd learned to be cautious about trusting adults. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she nodded slowly and then, without warning, threw her small arms around Margaret's neck. The embrace was desperate and clinging, the hug of a child who had been trying to be brave for too long. Margaret found herself holding the girl close, stroking her hair while her own heart broke and mended simultaneously. "Will you really wait with me?" Lucy whispered against Margaret's shoulder. "I will," Margaret promised, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. What Margaret didn't know was that 30 feet away, half hidden behind a support post, a tall man in a worn cowboy hat was watching their interaction with growing amazement. Luke Morrison had been working up the courage to approach the blonde woman who'd been haunting the station for weeks, not because he was interested in romance, but because he recognized the look of someone whose world had fallen apart. Maybe, Luke thought as he watched Margaret comfort his crying daughter, some prayers got answered in ways you never expected. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower when Luke Morrison finally worked up the courage to approach the 2 figures still sitting together on the station bench. His daughter had stopped crying, but she remained curled against the blonde woman's side like a small animal seeking warmth. Margaret, he'd heard her give her name, was stroking Lucy's hair with the unconscious gentleness of someone who understood what it meant to comfort a frightened child. Luke removed his hat as he drew near, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden platform. Both Margaret and Lucy looked up at his approach, and he saw Margaret's posture shift slightly, not quite defensive, but alert in the way of someone who'd learned to be cautious around men she didn't know. "Excuse me, ma'am," Luke said, his voice carefully modulated to sound as non-threatening as possible. "I believe this little one belongs to me." Lucy's face lit up with pure joy. "Papa!" she cried, scrambling off the bench and launching herself into his arms with the abandon of a child who had feared she might never see her father again. Luke caught her easily, swinging her up and holding her close while his own eyes grew suspiciously bright. "Hey there, little bit," he murmured against her hair. "I'm sorry I'm late. Got your telegram about Aunt Sarah being sick, and I rode as hard as I could to get here." Margaret watched this reunion with a mixture of relief and something that might have been loss. For the past 2 hours, she'd felt needed, useful, like she had a purpose beyond waiting for a man who would never come. Now that feeling was slipping away as the child who had briefly become hers returned to where she truly belonged. "Ma'am," Luke said, settling Lucy more securely in his arms while turning his attention to Margaret. "I can't thank you enough for looking after her. I saw, that is, I witnessed how kindly you treated her when she was distressed, and I'm more grateful than I can properly express." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication that he'd been watching them. "You saw?" "I was over by the freight office trying to work up the nerve to ask if you might be willing to help me with a problem," Luke admitted, his own cheeks reddening slightly. "See, I'm Luke Morrison, and this is my daughter Lucy. Her mother died 2 years ago, and I've been struggling to raise her on my own. My sister-in-law was supposed to take her for a few months while I got the ranch back on solid footing, but Aunt Sarah got the lung fever," Lucy piped up, apparently having overheard more of the adult conversations than anyone had realized. "Papa says she might not get better, and Uncle James already has 4 children and can't take care of me too." Margaret's heart clenched at the matter-of-fact way the child discussed being unwanted, even though it was clear from Luke's expression that Lucy was deeply loved, just inconveniently timed in a life that had no room for inconvenience. "I've been watching you these past weeks," Luke continued, his voice growing more hesitant. "Not in any improper way, but because I recognized something in your situation that reminded me of my own predicament. You've been waiting for someone who hasn't come, and I've been needing help that I don't know how to ask for." Margaret studied this tall, weathered man who spoke with such careful honesty. He was handsome in a rugged way, with kind eyes and hands that held his daughter with obvious tenderness. But more than his appearance, she was struck by his directness, his willingness to admit vulnerability and need. "What kind of help?" she asked quietly. "The kind where a man with a motherless daughter asks a woman with nowhere to go if she might consider a mutually beneficial arrangement," Luke said, the words coming out in a rush as if he'd been rehearsing them. "I'm not talking about, that is, I wouldn't expect. What I mean is, I need someone to help care for Lucy, teach her the things a girl needs to know that I can't manage. In return, I can offer you a home, food, safety, and enough wages to give you independence." Margaret blinked in surprise. She'd expected many things from this encounter, but not a job offer from a stranger who'd been watching her from afar. "You don't know anything about me," she pointed out reasonably. "I could be completely unsuitable for caring for children. I could be a criminal, or mentally unbalanced, or any number of things that would make me the last person you'd want near your daughter." "Could be," Luke agreed. "But I watched you comfort a crying child you'd never met before. I saw you promise to wait with her when you could have just walked away. I observed how you held her like she mattered to you, not like she was a burden or an inconvenience." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Sometimes you have to make decisions based on what you see in people's actions rather than what you know about their circumstances." Lucy, who had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention of a child who understood that her future was being decided, suddenly spoke up. "Papa, is the nice lady going to come home with us?" "That's up to the nice lady," Luke said gently, though Margaret could see hope and anxiety warring in his gray eyes. "Miss Hayes has to decide if she wants to help us." Margaret looked between father and daughter, this man who was offering her purpose when she'd lost all direction, this child who had filled a void in her heart she hadn't even realized was there. It wasn't the life she'd planned when she left Boston. It wasn't the romantic love story she dreamed of when she'd answered Robert McKinnon's letters, but it was real, immediate, and needed in a way that felt more substantial than any of her previous dreams. "I should tell you," she said slowly, "that I came here to marry a man who apparently decided not to show up. I've been living on this bench for 3 weeks because I have nowhere else to go and no money to get there. I'm not experienced with children. I've never lived on a ranch, and I have no idea if I'm suited for the kind of life you're describing. But, Luke prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice that suggested there was more to say. Margaret looked down at Lucy, who was watching her with those huge brown eyes full of hope and trust. But I've spent the last 2 hours feeling more useful and needed than I have in years. And this little girl deserves someone who will put her welfare first, even if that someone is still figuring out how to do it. Does that mean yes? Lucy asked, her voice bright with barely contained excitement. Margaret took a deep breath, making a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. That means yes, sweetheart. If your papa is willing to take a chance on a stranger, I'm willing to take a chance on being the help you both need. Luke's smile transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less careworn than he had just moments before. Miss Hayes, I think this might be the beginning of something good for all of us. As they gathered Margaret's meager belongings and prepared to leave the station that had been her temporary home for 3 weeks, Margaret realized she was no longer waiting for someone else to give her life meaning. Instead, she was choosing to create meaning through her own actions, her own decisions, her own willingness to step into an uncertain future, with people who needed her as much as she needed them. The ghost husband might never materialize, but the family she was about to join was real, present, and ready to welcome her not as a romantic ideal, but as herself, flaws, fears, and all. For the first time since arriving in Colorado territory, Margaret Hayes felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The Morrison Ranch sat in a valley between rolling hills dotted with cattle, the main house modest but well-built with a wide front porch that caught the evening light. As Luke helped Margaret down from the wagon, she felt a mixture of anticipation and terror at the reality of what she'd agreed to. This was her new home. These were her new responsibilities, and she had no idea if she was even remotely equipped for either. Lucy bounced down from the wagon seat with the resilience of childhood, her earlier distress forgotten in the excitement of showing Margaret around. "Come see my room," she announced, grabbing Margaret's hand with dusty fingers. "Papa painted it yellow because I told him yellow was like sunshine, and sunshine makes everything happy." Margaret allowed herself to be tugged toward the house, acutely aware of Luke following behind with her single carpet bag. The front door opened into a living area that was clean, but clearly the domain of two people who didn't quite know how to make a house feel like a home. The furniture was functional rather than comfortable, and while everything was neat, there was an absence of the small touches that turned a dwelling into something warmer. "This is where Papa reads to me at night," Lucy said, pointing to a well-worn chair beside the fireplace. "And that's the kitchen where we make breakfast. Except Papa's not very good at making anything except eggs and bacon, and sometimes the eggs get all burned and smoky." Luke cleared his throat, looking embarrassed. "I've been meaning to work on my cooking skills." "Papa tries really hard," Lucy said loyally, "but he says cooking is like speaking a language he never learned properly." Margaret smiled at the child's diplomatic way of explaining her father's limitations. "Well, I happen to speak that language fairly well. Perhaps I can teach your papa a few phrases while I'm learning ranch language from him." The suggestion seemed to relieve some of Luke's obvious anxiety about his domestic shortcomings. He led them through the rest of the house, a small but adequate kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a third room that he'd clearly been using as an office, but which had a narrow bed tucked into one corner. "I thought you might want this room," Luke said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "It's not much, but it has the best light during the day, and there's space for your things. I can move my ranch papers to the kitchen table if you need more room." Margaret looked around the space that would be hers, the first room she'd had to herself since leaving Boston. It was simple but clean, with a window that looked out over the hills and a small dresser that would easily hold her few possessions. More importantly, it represented something she'd begun to think she'd lost forever. A place where she belonged, where she had a purpose beyond mere survival. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it. "Thank you." The first few days passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Margaret learned that Lucy was intelligent, but had been essentially raising herself in many ways, with Luke providing love and protection, but lacking the knowledge of how to guide a young girl through the complexities of growing up. The child could saddle a horse and knew the names of every cow on the ranch, but she couldn't properly brush her own hair or knew nothing about the social graces that would help her navigate relationships with other children. Margaret also learned that Luke Morrison was a man of quiet competence, who ran his ranch with careful attention to detail and genuine care for his animals and land. He was patient with Lucy's endless questions, gentle with skittish horses, and possessed the kind of steady reliability that made Margaret understand why he'd been so frustrated by his inability to manage the domestic aspects of single parenthood. "I can teach her to shoot and ride and work cattle," he confided to Margaret one evening as they watched Lucy play with a barn cat on the front porch. "But I have no idea how to help her become the kind of woman her mother would have wanted her to be." "What was her mother like?" Margaret asked, realizing that in all their practical discussions about Lucy's care, the subject of the child's deceased mother had never come up. Luke's expression grew soft with memory and grief. She was everything I'm not. Graceful, social, knew how to make anyone feel welcome in her presence. She could have lived anywhere, could have married anyone, but she chose to build a life with me in the middle of nowhere." He paused, watching Lucy's laughing attempts to catch the elusive cat. "Lucy has her mother's heart, generous, trusting, eager to love and be loved. But she also has my stubbornness and my tendency to say exactly what I'm thinking without considering how it might sound to others." Margaret found herself charmed by this description of both mother and daughter. That combination could take her far in life, with the right guidance. "That's what I'm hoping you can provide," Luke said. "The guidance part, I mean. The social skills, the understanding of how to be a woman in a world that has very particular expectations." Over the following weeks, Margaret threw herself into this new role with determination and growing affection. She taught Lucy how to braid her hair properly, how to set a table for company, how to make conversation with visitors without appearing either shy or forward. But more than that, she began to understand the deep well of love that existed between father and daughter, and her own place in nurturing that bond rather than competing with it. The breakthrough came on a rainy afternoon when Lucy fell from a fence she'd been climbing, despite repeated warnings. The child scraped her knee badly and came running to the house in tears, automatically seeking Margaret instead of her father, who was working in the barn. "It hurts," Lucy sobbed, throwing herself into Margaret's arms with complete trust. "And Papa's going to be mad because he told me not to climb on the wet fence." Margaret cleaned the wound gently, applied salve and a bandage, and then held the child while she cried out her pain and fear. When Luke came in from the barn and saw them sitting together on the sofa, his expression shifted through concern, relief, and something deeper that made Margaret's heart skip unexpectedly. "Is she all right?" he asked, approaching with the careful movements of a man trying not to startle an already upset child. "I'm fine, Papa," Lucy said, lifting her head from Margaret's shoulder. "Margaret fixed my knee and made it stop hurting so much. And she didn't even scold me for being careless like I thought she would." Luke knelt down beside the sofa, bringing himself to Lucy's eye level. "Scolding isn't always the answer to accidents, little bit. Sometimes taking care of the hurt is more important than pointing out the mistake." "Is that what Mama would have done?" Lucy asked, and Margaret felt Luke's sharp intake of breath at the innocent question. "Yes," Luke said after a moment, his voice slightly rough. "That's exactly what your mama would have done." Lucy seemed satisfied with this answer, snuggling more comfortably against Margaret's side. "I like having Margaret here, Papa. It feels more like having a family again." That evening, after Lucy had gone to bed with a story and extra attention to her bandaged knee, Margaret and Luke found themselves sitting on the front porch in comfortable silence. The air was cool after the afternoon rain, and the stars were beginning to emerge in the clearing sky. "She's getting attached to you," Luke said finally, not looking at Margaret but gazing out at his land. "And I'm getting attached to her," Margaret replied honestly. "Is that a problem?" Luke was quiet for so long that Margaret began to worry she'd said something wrong, crossed some line she hadn't known existed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion she hadn't heard before. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." She turned to look at him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he was gripping the porch railing. "All right. This arrangement we made, it was supposed to be temporary, practical. You helping me with Lucy while you figured out what to do next with your life." Luke met her eyes then, and she saw vulnerability there that took her breath away. But Lucy's right. We're starting to feel like a family, and I'm scared that when you're ready to move on, when you find what you're really looking for, losing you will break her heart. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest at his words. What makes you think I'm still looking for something else? Because you're young, beautiful, intelligent. Because you came here looking for love and romance, not to be a governess to a rancher's daughter in the middle of nowhere. Because someday a man is going to see what I see in you and offer you the kind of life you originally wanted. The honesty in his voice, the assumption that she was somehow settling for less than she deserved, made Margaret realize that somewhere along the way, her definition of what she wanted had fundamentally changed. Luke, she said softly, what if I told you that I'm not the same woman who came here looking for Robert McKinnon? What if the life I thought I wanted wasn't actually what I needed? He turned to face her fully then, hope and fear warring in his expression. What are you saying? I'm saying that for the first time in my life, I wake up every morning knowing exactly why I'm needed, exactly how I can make a difference in someone's life. I'm saying that Lucy has filled spaces in my heart I didn't know were empty. And watching you be a father has shown me what real love looks like. Not the dramatic passion I thought I wanted, but the steady, reliable devotion that builds something lasting. Margaret took a deep breath, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. I'm saying that if you're asking me to stay permanently, to make this arrangement something more official and lasting, my answer is yes. Not because I'm settling, but because I've found something better than what I was originally looking for. Luke's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face with relief and joy. Margaret Hayes, are you saying you'd consider marrying a rancher who can't cook and whose daughter climbs fences in the rain? I'm saying I'd consider marrying a good man who loves his daughter enough to ask for help raising her, and whose daughter has already asked me to be her mom in every way that matters. As Luke reached for her hand, Margaret realized that sometimes the best things in life came not from the plans you made, but from the courage to embrace the unexpected gifts that arrived when your original plans fell apart. The news of Luke Morrison's engagement to the woman from the train station spread through Cedar Creek faster than wildfire in dry grass. By the time Margaret accompanied Luke and Lucy to town the following Saturday, it seemed like every person they encountered had an opinion about the arrangement. Mighty sudden, isn't it? Mrs. Henderson observed as Margaret selected fabric for a new dress, her first purchase for herself since arriving in Colorado territory. Known each other, what, a month now? Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but Lucy piped up before she could respond. Sometimes you just know when someone belongs in your family, the little girl said with the matter-of-fact wisdom of childhood. Margaret belonged with us from the very first day. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened at Lucy's earnest declaration. Well, I suppose that's as good a reason as any for getting married. Better than some I've heard, anyway. The real test came when they encountered Reverend Phillips outside the general store. The elderly minister approached them with the careful expression of someone who'd heard rumors and wanted to verify facts before passing judgment. Luke, he said with a nod of greeting. Miss Hayes, I understand congratulations may be in order? Yes, sir, Luke replied, his arm moving protectively around Margaret's shoulders. We'd like to arrange for a wedding ceremony if you'd be willing to perform it. Reverend Phillips studied them both with sharp eyes that had seen decades of human nature in all its forms. This is quite a development from the practical arrangement you described when you first brought Miss Hayes to Sunday service. Margaret felt her stomach clench with anxiety. She'd known this moment would come. The questioning of their motives, the suggestion that their union was somehow improper or rushed. But before she could formulate a response, Lucy stepped forward with the confidence of a child who'd never learned to doubt her own perceptions. Reverend Phillips, she said seriously, do you think God minds when people find each other in ways that aren't exactly normal? The old minister's eyebrows rose at the unexpected question. What do you mean, child? Well, Papa needed help with me, and Margaret needed a place to belong. But then we all started loving each other, and now we want to be a real family. Lucy looked between her father and Margaret with complete certainty. It wasn't like in the stories where people meet at dances and get all swoony, but it feels more real than stories anyway. Reverend Phillips was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret found herself holding her breath while waiting for his verdict. When he finally spoke, his voice was warm with understanding. Lucy, my dear, I think God is far more interested in the love people build together than in how they happen to meet. And from what I can see, you three have built something worth blessing. He turned to Luke and Margaret with a smile. When would you like to have the ceremony? The relief in Luke's shoulders was palpable. As soon as possible, if that's acceptable. We don't need anything elaborate, just something simple with Lucy and whatever friends choose to attend. 2 weeks from today, Reverend Phillips decided. That will give folks time to adjust to the idea and give you time to make whatever preparations you'd like. As they walked back to the wagon, Lucy skipping ahead of them with evident joy, Luke took Margaret's hand. Any regrets about making this official? Margaret considered the question seriously. 3 months ago, she would never have imagined herself preparing to marry a man she'd known for mere weeks, to become stepmother to a child who wasn't her own, to build a life that bore no resemblance to the romantic dreams that had brought her west. None, she said, and realized she meant it completely. Luke, do you ever wonder what would have happened if Robert McKinnon had actually shown up that day at the station? Luke's grip on her hand tightened slightly. Do you? Sometimes, Margaret admitted. But then I watch you with Lucy, or I see how happy she is when we're all together, or I wake up in the morning knowing exactly what my day will bring and why it matters. And I realize that Robert McKinnon would have been the wrong choice even if he had been the right man. How do you figure that? Margaret stopped walking, turning to face Luke fully. Because he would have married me for romance, for the idea of love, for the fantasy of what a wife should be. You're marrying me because you've seen who I actually am. Practical, stubborn, occasionally cranky before my morning coffee, better with children than I ever expected to be. You're not marrying an ideal, you're marrying a real person, and you're letting that real person love the real you in return. Luke's smile was soft and wondering. When did you become so wise about love? When I stopped looking for it in letters and started recognizing it in daily kindnesses, Margaret replied. When I realized that the best love stories aren't about finding your perfect match, but about choosing to become perfect matches for each other. 2 weeks later, Margaret stood in front of the small mirror in her room, adjusting the collar of her new blue dress and trying to calm the butterflies in her stomach. She could hear voices from the main room, neighbors who had come to witness the ceremony, friends who had embraced this unconventional union with surprising warmth. Lucy appeared in the doorway, resplendent in a yellow dress Margaret had sewn for her. Margaret, you look beautiful. Papa's going to cry when he sees you. Is he nervous? Margaret asked, smoothing her hair one final time. A little, Lucy admitted, but the good kind of nervous, like when you're excited about something wonderful that's about to happen. She paused, then added with the seriousness that sometimes made her seem older than her years. Margaret, are you nervous about becoming my mama for real? Margaret knelt down to Lucy's level, taking the child's hands in hers. Lucy, I want you to understand something important. I'm not becoming your mama today. I've been your mama since the moment you asked me to be, that very first day at the train station. Today is just making it official so the whole world knows what we already knew. Lucy's smile was radiant. I love you, Mama. The word hit Margaret like a physical force, filling spaces in her heart she hadn't known existed. I love you too, sweetheart, more than I knew was possible. The ceremony itself was simple but perfect. Luke wore his best suit and stood at the front of their living room with an expression of wonder and gratitude that made Margaret's heart skip. Lucy stood beside them, holding a bouquet of wildflowers and beaming at everyone who looked her way. When Reverend Phillips asked if anyone objected to the union, Lucy spoke up before anyone else could. I object to anyone who thinks this isn't the most perfect wedding ever, she declared, causing laughter to ripple through the small gathering. Luke's vows were simple and true. Margaret, you came into our lives when we needed you most, but you stayed because we needed each other. I promise to love you not just as my wife, but as Lucy's mother, as my partner in everything we build together, and as the woman who taught me that sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in unexpected packages. Margaret's vows came from the deepest part of her heart. Luke, you and Lucy gave me something I didn't know I was missing. A purpose that comes from being needed, not for what I could provide, but for who I am. I promise to love your daughter as my own, to stand beside you in whatever challenges we face, and to choose our family every single day for the rest of my life." When Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife, Lucy cheered so loudly that everyone laughed. And when Luke kissed his new bride, Margaret realized that she had finally found what she'd been searching for all along. Not the passionate romance of novels, but the steady, deep love that came from building a life with people who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. As neighbors offered congratulations and Lucy chattered excitedly about having a real mom at last, Margaret caught sight of herself in the window reflection, a woman surrounded by family and friends, glowing with happiness and purpose. The ghost husband had never materialized, but the real husband standing beside her and the daughter now truly hers were worth more than any fantasy could ever have been. Sometimes the best love stories began not with passion, but with need. Not with perfection, but with two imperfect people deciding to create something beautiful together, one day at a time. 3 months into their marriage, Margaret Morrison had settled into a rhythm of happiness she'd never imagined possible. The ranch house had transformed under her care. Curtains at the windows, fresh bread cooling on the kitchen counter, Lucy's laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent too long. But on a crisp October morning, as she hung laundry on the line behind the house, that carefully constructed peace shattered with the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Margaret shaded her eyes against the morning sun, watching a lone rider approach the house. Something about the man's posture, the way he sat his horse, sent an uneasiness crawling up her spine. Luke was out checking the north pasture with Lucy, teaching her how to spot signs of sick cattle, a father-daughter tradition that had become one of Margaret's favorite things about their life together. The rider drew closer, and Margaret's hands stilled on the wet sheet she'd been pinning to the line. The man was well-dressed in a way that spoke of city living and comfortable circumstances. His dark hair was neatly trimmed beneath an expensive hat, and his horse was clearly bred for show rather than ranch work. Everything about him screamed outsider, visitor, trouble. But it wasn't until he dismounted and turned toward her that Margaret felt the bottom drop out of her world. Even across the distance of months and miles, even changed by travel and time, she recognized the face from the carefully preserved photograph she'd once carried. The face that had haunted her dreams of romantic love and domestic bliss. Robert McKinnon had finally come to claim his bride. "Margaret?" His voice carried across the yard, uncertain but hopeful. "Margaret Hayes? My God, I can't believe I've finally found you." Margaret's legs felt suddenly weak, as if they might not support her weight. She gripped the laundry basket with white knuckles, trying to process the impossibility of his presence. "Robert," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. He approached with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having his presence welcomed, his face lighting up with what appeared to be genuine joy and relief. "I know this must be a shock, seeing me after all this time. I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am for the delay, how frantically I've been searching for you." Margaret stared at him, this man who had once represented all her hopes for the future, trying to reconcile his presence with the life she'd built in his absence. He was handsome, just as his photograph had suggested. Refined features, kind eyes, the sort of man any sensible woman would be grateful to marry. 3 months ago, his arrival would have been the answer to every prayer. Now he felt like an intrusion from another life entirely. "I don't understand," she said finally, finding her voice, though it shook with emotion she couldn't quite identify. "You were supposed to meet me at Cedar Creek Station in April." "It's October, Robert. Where have you been?" His expression grew pained, regret evident in every line of his face. "There was an accident, Margaret. A terrible accident just days before you were scheduled to arrive. I was thrown from my horse and suffered a head injury that left me unconscious for weeks. By the time I recovered enough to travel, you'd disappeared from the station. No one could tell me where you'd gone." The explanation was reasonable, logical, the kind of tragic misunderstanding that could easily account for their missed connection. Margaret felt guilt twist in her stomach at the realization that while she'd been building a new life with Luke and Lucy, Robert had been injured, possibly fighting for his life. "I'm so sorry," she said, meaning it. "I had no way of knowing. When you didn't come, I assumed—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would reveal how quickly she'd given up on him, how readily she'd embraced an alternative future. "I know what you must have assumed," Robert said gently, stepping closer. "Any woman would have thought the same. But I never stopped looking for you, Margaret. I've spent months traveling from town to town, following every lead, hoping against hope that I'd find you safe and well." His eyes took in her appearance. The simple work dress, the sun-touched skin, the calluses on her hands from months of ranch life. "And here you are, more beautiful than ever." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks at his admiration, but also a strange discomfort. This wasn't how she'd imagined their reunion during all those lonely nights at the train station. There was no rush of romantic feeling, no sense of destiny finally fulfilled. Instead, she felt only confusion and a growing dread about what his presence would mean for the family she'd built. "Robert," she began, but was interrupted by the sound of voices approaching from the direction of the barn. Luke and Lucy were returning from their ride, their conversation carrying on the morning air. Luke's deep voice answering one of Lucy's endless questions about ranch management. Robert followed Margaret's gaze, his expression shifting to curiosity as he took in the sight of the tall rancher, helping a young girl down from her horse. "Friends of yours or your own?" he asked. Margaret's throat went dry. "Robert, there's something you need to know. Something that's happened since we missed each other." But before she could find the words to explain, Lucy spotted the stranger and came running across the yard with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Mama!" she called out, using the name that had become as natural as breathing over the past months. "Mama, who's the fancy man with the pretty horse?" Robert's face went very still at Lucy's words, his gaze snapping back to Margaret with dawning understanding. "Mama?" he repeated softly. Luke approached more slowly, his rancher's instincts clearly alerted by the tension he could sense even from a distance. When he reached Margaret's side, his arm moved instinctively around her waist, a gesture of protection and possession that spoke of months of growing intimacy and shared experience. "Margaret!" Luke's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the question beneath it, the concern of a man who recognized potential threat when he saw it. Margaret felt trapped between two worlds, two versions of herself, two different futures that could never coexist. "Luke," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "this is Robert McKinnon. Robert, this is my husband, Luke Morrison, and our daughter Lucy." The words hung in the air like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Robert's face cycled through disbelief, hurt, and what might have been anger before settling into a careful mask of politeness. "Your husband," he repeated, his voice flat with shock. "I see. And when did this marriage take place?" 2 months ago, Luke answered when Margaret seemed unable to speak. His voice was steady, but his body language was pure territorial male, protective, alert, ready for whatever challenge this stranger might represent. Robert's laugh was bitter, though he tried to disguise it as something lighter. 2 months. So while I was lying unconscious in a hospital bed in Denver, fighting to recover so I could find my intended bride, she was marrying someone else. The accusation in his tone made Lucy step closer to Margaret, her child's instincts picking up on the adult tension, even if she didn't fully understand it. Margaret's hand dropped automatically to Lucy's shoulder, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by either man. "Robert," Margaret said, finally finding her voice, "I waited for you. I waited for weeks with nowhere to go and no money to get there. I had no way of knowing what had happened to you, no reason to believe you would ever come. So you gave up," he said, and the pain in his voice was unmistakable. "You gave up and married the first man who offered you security." Luke's body went rigid at the implication, but it was Lucy who spoke up before anyone else could respond. "That's not true," she said indignantly, her small hands on her hips in a gesture that was pure Luke. "Mama didn't marry Papa for security. She married him because we love each other and we're a family." The simple honesty in Lucy's declaration seemed to hit Robert like a physical blow. He looked between the three of them, husband, wife, and child, and Margaret could see him taking in the obvious bonds that connected them, the easy intimacy that spoke of genuine affection rather than mere convenience. "I see," he said quietly, his anger deflating into something that looked more like grief. "And I suppose there's no room in this family for the man who was supposed to be here first?" The question hung between them, loaded with months of missed chances and roads not taken. Margaret felt her heart breaking, not for lost love, but for the pain she could see in Robert's face, for the impossibility of a situation that had no good solution for anyone involved. But what she realized, standing there with Luke's arm around her and Lucy pressed against her side, was that her answer had never really been in doubt. Not from the moment she'd chosen to comfort a crying child at a train station, not from the day she'd agreed to help a struggling father, not from the night she'd realized that the love she'd built was stronger than any love she'd dreamed. "Robert," she said softly, "I'm sorry. I'm sorrier than I can possibly express." But no, there isn't. The silence that followed Margaret's declaration stretched taut as a wire fence in winter, threatening to snap under the weight of everything left unsaid. Robert McKinnon stood frozen for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions too complex for easy reading. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful control of a man trying not to shatter completely. "I see," he said, though clearly he didn't see it all. 3 months. 3 months was all it took for you to forget about the future we'd planned, the promises we'd made to each other." "We made no promises," Margaret replied, finding strength in Luke's steady presence beside her. "We exchanged letters, Robert. We shared hopes and possibilities, but we never stood before God and witnesses and pledged our lives to each other. You didn't come, and life moved forward." Robert's carefully maintained composure began to crack. "I didn't come because I was lying unconscious in a hospital bed. I didn't come because I nearly died trying to prepare a home worthy of the woman I thought I loved." His voice rose with each word, years of imagined conversations and planned explanations pouring out in a rush of frustrated pain. "Do you have any idea what I've been through these past months? The guilt, the worry, the desperate searching." Luke's arm tightened protectively around Margaret's waist, but his voice remained level when he spoke. "I'm sorry for what you went through, McKinnon. No man should have to face that kind of suffering, but Margaret went through her own hell during those weeks when you didn't show. She waited until she had nothing left to wait with. And then you swooped in to rescue the abandoned bride," Robert shot back, his gentlemanly facade crumbling to reveal the raw hurt beneath. "How convenient for you. How noble." "That's enough," Margaret said sharply, stepping forward before Luke could respond to the provocation. "You don't know anything about what happened between Luke and me, or why we made the choices we made. You have no right to stand there and judge decisions you weren't here to be part of." Lucy, who had been pressed against Margaret's side throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up with the clear voice of childhood, cutting through adult complications. "Why is the fancy man being mean to Mama and Papa? Did we do something wrong?" The innocent question hit all three adults like a physical blow. Margaret knelt down to Lucy's level, her hands gentle on the child's shoulders. "No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. The fancy man, Mr. McKinnon, he's just confused and sad because some things didn't work out the way he expected them to. Like when I expected Aunt Sarah to take care of me, but she got sick instead," Lucy asked with the logic of a 6-year-old trying to make sense of adult disappointments. "Something like that," Margaret agreed, her throat tight with emotion. Robert watched this interaction with growing realization. The tenderness between Margaret and the child wasn't performed for his benefit. It was real, deep, the kind of bond that formed through months of daily care and growing love. Whatever he'd expected to find when he finally tracked down his missing bride, it hadn't been this. A woman who'd become a mother, a wife who'd found her place in the world without him. "She calls you Mama," he said quietly, the fight going out of him as understanding dawned. "She has for months," Margaret replied, rising to face him again, "from almost the very first day we met. And I've been her mother in every way that matters since then. And him," Robert's gaze shifted to Luke, taking in the rancher's protective stance. the way he seemed to anchor Margaret simply by being near. How long did it take you to fall in love with him? The question was loaded with pain and accusation, but Margaret found herself answering with complete honesty. I don't know that I can pinpoint a moment when it happened. It wasn't like the romantic stories I used to read, where people meet and instantly know they're destined for each other. It was gradual, growing, built on shared responsibilities and small kindnesses, and the realization that we were better together than apart. That's not love, Robert said desperately. That's partnership, practicality. What about passion? What about the meeting of souls that makes everything else fade away? Luke spoke before Margaret could answer, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. McKinnon, I've got to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. When you were writing those letters to Margaret, when you were imagining your future together, what did you actually know about her? Not what you hoped she might be, but what you actually knew about who she was as a person. Robert opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, clearly struggling with the question. Because here's what I know about my wife, Luke continued. I know she hums while she cooks breakfast, and that she always burns the first pancake, but never gets discouraged enough to stop trying. I know she reads to Lucy every night, and that she cries during the sad parts, even though she's heard the stories 100 times. I know she's stubborn as a mule when she thinks she's right, and she's right more often than I care to admit. I know she's brave enough to comfort a stranger's crying child and practical enough to marry a man she barely knew because it was the right thing for everyone involved. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at this catalog of intimate knowledge, these small details that added up to a complete picture of who she really was. I know she takes her coffee with 2 spoonfuls of sugar, and that she sings hymns while she does the washing, Luke went on relentlessly. I know she's afraid of thunderstorms, but won't admit it, and that she checks on Lucy 3 times every night just to make sure she's still breathing. I know she loves my daughter like she bore her herself, and that she's made both our lives better in ways I couldn't have imagined when I first asked for her help. Robert's face had grown pale during this recitation. When Luke finished, the silence stretched long and painful before Robert finally spoke. You're right, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I fell in love with an idea. A dream of what a wife should be, what a family should look like. I never really knew Margaret at all. Margaret felt her heart break a little for this man who'd traveled so far to claim something that had never truly been his to begin with. Robert, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you were hurt. Sorry you've spent months searching for something that was already lost before you even began looking. But I can't unmake the choices I've made. I can't unlive the life I've built. And if I'd arrived 3 months ago? Robert asked, one last desperate attempt to understand how things had gone so wrong. If I'd been there when the train arrived, if there had been no accident, no delay. Margaret considered the question seriously, knowing he deserved her complete honesty. Then you would have married a woman who was running away from loneliness and disappointment. You would have gotten someone who was looking for rescue rather than partnership. I'm not that woman anymore, Robert. The person I've become through loving Luke and Lucy. She's someone I like much better than the woman I used to be. Lucy tugged on Margaret's skirt, looking up with worried eyes. Mama, are you going to go away with the fancy man? Are you going to stop being my mama? The question pierced through all the adult complications and landed at the heart of what really mattered. Margaret knelt down again, pulling Lucy into a fierce embrace. Never, she said firmly. I will never stop being your mama, sweetheart. This is our home, this is our family, and nothing is going to change that. Over Lucy's head, Margaret met Robert's eyes and saw acceptance there at last. Painful, reluctant, but real. He nodded slowly, the gesture of a man finally understanding that some battles were lost before they'd even begun. I should go, he said quietly. I should have realized. When I saw how you looked at them, how they looked at you, I should have known then that I was too late. Where will you go? Margaret asked, genuine concern in her voice despite everything. Robert managed a small, sad smile. Back to Denver, I suppose, start over. Maybe this time I'll try to fall in love with a real woman instead of a fantasy. He looked at Lucy, still clinging to Margaret's neck, and his expression softened. Take care of your mama, little one. She's lucky to have someone who loves her so fiercely. I will, Lucy promised solemnly, and Papa will take care of both of us. As Robert mounted his horse and prepared to leave, he turned back one final time. Margaret, I hope you'll be happy. I hope this unconventional family of yours brings you all the joy you deserve. It already has, Margaret replied truthfully. More than I ever dreamed possible. They watched him ride away until he was just a speck on the horizon, and then Luke turned Margaret to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Are you all right? He asked softly. Margaret looked up at her husband, this good man who'd shown her what real love looked like through actions rather than words, and smiled. I'm exactly where I belong, she said, with exactly the people I belong with. And as Lucy grabbed both their hands and pulled them toward the house, chattering about lunch and afternoon chores and the new kittens in the barn, Margaret realized that sometimes the best love stories weren't about finding your other half, but about choosing to become whole together, one ordinary day at a time. The ghost husband had finally been laid to rest. The real family could continue building their future. 6 months after Robert McKinnon's unexpected visit, the Morrison Ranch had settled into a rhythm of contentment that felt as natural as breathing. The winter had been mild, the cattle healthy, and Lucy had grown 3 inches and gained enough confidence to help Margaret teach Sunday school at the little church in Cedar Creek. But it was the letter that arrived on a crisp March morning that truly marked how far they had all traveled from that day at the train station. Margaret was kneading bread in the kitchen when she heard Luke's boots on the front porch, followed by the sound of paper rustling. He appeared in the kitchen doorway holding an envelope, his expression somewhere between amusement and wonder. Mail for you, Mrs. Morrison, he said, emphasizing her married name with the fond teasing that had become one of their private jokes. Looks official. Margaret wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and took the letter, recognizing the neat handwriting immediately. It's from Robert, she said, surprised by how little the sight of his familiar script affected her. Once, those carefully formed letters had represented hope and possibility. Now they were simply marks on paper from someone she'd once known. Good news or bad? Luke asked, settling into his chair at the kitchen table, where Lucy was practicing her letters with tongue poking out concentration. Margaret opened the envelope and scanned the brief message, her eyebrows rising with genuine surprise and pleasure. Very good news, actually. He's engaged. Luke's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. Is he now? Anyone we know. A widow in Denver named Catherine Walsh. She has 2 young children and, according to Robert, a practical nature and a kind heart that have taught him the difference between loving someone and loving the idea of someone. Margaret folded the letter with a smile. He sounds happy. Really happy, not just trying to convince himself he should be. Lucy looked up from her writing practice, her pencil smudged across one cheek. Is that the fancy man who came to visit? The one who made Mama sad? The very same, Margaret confirmed, sitting down beside her daughter to examine the carefully copied alphabet. But he's not sad anymore, sweetheart. He found his own family, just like we found each other. Good, Lucy declared with the firm satisfaction of a child who believed in justice. Everyone should have a family that loves them exactly right. Margaret exchanged a look with Luke over Lucy's bent head, both of them struck by their daughter's simple wisdom. Everyone should have a family that loves them exactly right. It was perhaps the most perfect description of what they'd built together that Margaret had ever heard. Speaking of families, Luke said, reaching into his shirt pocket to pull out a small wrapped package. I have something for both my girls. Lucy's head snapped up immediately, her letters forgotten. Is it a present? Is it someone's birthday that I forgot? Not a birthday, Luke said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. More like a celebration of how far we've come. Margaret watched as he handed Lucy the package first, her heart warming at the sight of her husband's gentle patience as Lucy struggled with the twine. When the wrapping finally fell away, Lucy gasped with delight. It's a locket, she breathed, holding up the small golden heart on its delicate chain. A real grown-up lady locket. Open it, Luke encouraged, and when Lucy managed to work the tiny clasp, she found a miniature photograph inside. One of the formal portraits they'd had taken during their last trip to town, showing all 3 of them together. Now you can carry your family with you wherever you go, Luke explained, helping Lucy fasten the chain around her neck. Even when you're old enough to go visiting friends or traveling to see your cousins. Lucy threw her arms around Luke's neck with the fierce enthusiasm that made everything worthwhile. Thank you, Papa. It's the most beautiful present ever. But Margaret noticed Luke still held something in his other hand, something he seemed almost nervous about giving her. Luke, is there more? He cleared his throat, suddenly looking like a schoolboy about to recite in front of the class. Margaret, we've been married almost a year now, and I realized I never properly courted you. Never gave you the chance to be romanced the way a woman should be before she says yes to spending her life with someone. Margaret felt her cheeks warm with surprise and affection. Luke Morrison, are you trying to court me after the fact? Maybe I am, he admitted, placing the second package in her hands. Maybe I want to make sure you know that what we have isn't just practical or convenient. Maybe I want you to understand that somewhere along the way, I fell completely, helplessly in love with the woman who comforted my crying daughter and stayed to become our family. Look through it, Luke said softly, and Margaret turned the pages to find entry after entry. Observations, memories, small moments from their life together that Luke had recorded without her knowledge. Margaret hummed while making breakfast this morning, the same hymn her mother used to sing, she told Lucy. Watching her move around our kitchen, I realized how empty this house was before she filled it with music. Lucy skinned her knee today and ran straight to Margaret instead of me. Instead of feeling displaced, I felt grateful. My daughter has a mother again, and I have a partner who loves her as fiercely as I do. Margaret spent an hour tonight mending my work shirt, even though it's nearly worn beyond saving. When I asked her why she didn't just add it to the rag pile, she said, because it's your favorite, and taking care of the things you love is what families do. Sometimes I think she understands love better than I do. Margaret's vision blurred as she read entry after entry, each one a small testament to the life they'd built together. The love they'd grown day by day through ordinary moments and shared responsibilities. Luke, she whispered, unable to find words adequate for what his gift meant to her. There's more, he said, and she looked up to find him watching her with an expression of such tender vulnerability that her heart squeezed with overwhelming love. He reached across the table and took her flour-dusted hands in his work-roughened ones. Margaret Morrison, I know I already married you once, but I'd like to ask you again, properly this time. Not because we need each other, not because it's practical or convenient, but because I love you, because you've made me a better man and a better father. Because Lucy lights up when you walk into a room, and because I can't imagine my life without your laughter filling our home. Lucy had gone very still, sensing the importance of the moment even if she didn't fully understand it. Will you marry me again, Margaret? Will you choose our life together, not because you have to, but because you want to? Margaret looked around their kitchen, at the bread rising on the counter, at Lucy's schoolwork scattered across the table, at the curtains she'd sewn fluttering in the spring breeze. This wasn't the romantic, passionate love story she'd once dreamed of, but it was something better. It was real, tested, built to last through ordinary days and extraordinary challenges alike. Yes, she said, her voice steady and sure. Yes, I'll marry you again. I'll choose you again. I'll choose this life, this family, this love we've built together every single day for the rest of my life. Luke's smile was radiant, and Lucy cheered as if she were at a circus performance, but Margaret wasn't finished. And Luke Morrison, she continued, standing up to face him properly, I want you to know that you didn't just give me a home and a daughter when you offered me this life. You gave me myself. The woman I was meant to be. The mother I never knew I could become. The wife who doesn't have to pretend to be anything other than exactly who she is. When Luke kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise, Margaret tasted their future together. Years of shared mornings, Lucy's wedding someday, grandchildren to spoil, the quiet satisfaction of a love that had chosen to grow stronger rather than simply burning bright and fast. Are we having another wedding? Lucy asked excitedly when they finally broke apart. Can I wear my yellow dress again? Can we have cake? We can have the biggest cake in Colorado territory, Luke promised, swinging Lucy up into his arms. Because some love stories are worth celebrating twice. As Margaret looked at her husband and daughter, both of them grinning at her with identical expressions of joy and mischief, she realized that Robert McKinnon had been right about one thing. She had forgotten about the future she'd originally planned. But that was because she discovered something infinitely better. A present so rich with love and purpose and belonging that the future could only be an extension of the happiness she'd already found. The ghost husband was truly gone, replaced by a real man who loved her not for who she might become, but for who she already was. And their daughter, because Lucy was theirs now in every way that mattered, would grow up knowing that the best families weren't always the ones you were born into, but sometimes the ones you chose to create through love, commitment, and the daily decision to put each other first. Outside, spring was painting the Colorado landscape in shades of hope and renewal. Inside, the Morrison family was writing the next chapter of their own love story, not with dramatic gestures or passionate declarations, but with flower-dusted hands, shared laughter, and the quiet certainty that they had found exactly where they belonged. And there you have it, folks. The incredible true story of Margaret Hayes, who waited 3 weeks for a ghost husband and found something infinitely better, a real family that chose her exactly as she was. What strikes me most about Margaret's journey isn't just the romance. Though Luke Morrison's retroactive courtship with that handwritten journal might be one of the sweetest gestures in Wild West history. No, what gets me is how this story completely flips our modern ideas about instant gratification and perfect timing upside down. Think about it. Margaret's entire life changed because she made one simple choice: to comfort a crying child she'd never met before. She had no idea that small act of kindness would lead to becoming a mother, a wife, and finding the kind of love that grows stronger through daily choices rather than dramatic moments. And Luke, he could have kept struggling alone, too proud to admit he needed help. Instead, he took a chance on a stranded stranger and discovered that sometimes the best partnerships begin not with passion, but with mutual need and respect. But here's what really moves me about their story. When Robert McKinnon finally showed up, the man Margaret had originally traveled 2,000 miles to marry, she didn't hesitate for even a moment. She knew exactly where she belonged, exactly who she was meant to be with. That's the kind of certainty that only comes from real love, tested by time and daily life. Lucy's innocent wisdom throughout this tale reminds us that children see truth more clearly than adults sometimes do. Everyone should have a family that loves them exactly right, she said. And isn't that what we're all searching for? Not perfect love, but the right love, love that accepts us as we are, while inspiring us to become better. Margaret's story proves that sometimes our biggest disappointments are actually life redirecting us towards something we didn't even know we needed. That ghost husband who never showed up, he led her straight to the man who would love her not for the fantasy version of herself, but for the real woman she was becoming. The American frontier was full of stories like this. People thrown together by circumstance, creating families not through blood, but through choice, building love not through romance novels, but through shared hardship and daily kindness. If Margaret Hayes Morrison could see us now, I think she'd want you to know that it's never too late to choose love over loneliness, courage over comfort, and hope over heartbreak. Sometimes the best things in life come not when you're looking for them, but when you're busy helping someone else. What do you think? Have you ever experienced a moment like Margaret's, when helping someone else led to unexpected blessings in your own life? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to hear that love comes in all kinds of packages, not just the ones we think we ordered. And hey, if these Wild West love stories are speaking to your heart, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got so many more incredible tales of frontier romance, second chances, and families forged in the fires of the American West. Because at Wild West Stories, we believe every heart deserves a happy ending, even if it doesn't look anything like the one you originally planned. Until next time, keep believing in love, keep choosing kindness, and remember, sometimes the best adventures begin when your original plans fall apart. See you on the frontier, friends.